right now. And just to summarize where we've gone until now, we're talking about this verse, Lo tiyeh meshakela bakara ba'artzecha et mispar yamecha amaleh. And God says, there shall be no barren or bereaved woman in your land, and I will fulfill the days of your life. I will fill the days of your life, excuse me. And it opened up into this entire discussion about serving God. What exactly is serving God? And then that brought us into the question, does God care? And we quoted this Kabbalistic work called Avodat HaKodesh, which said that, on a certain level, God does care, but at a deeper level, the source of sources, it's truly God does not care. God is beyond these things. And so the Rebbe explained that there's different dimensions of looking at this conversation. So on the first level we spoke about was the orot and the kelim, the energy or the light that God creates the world with, that establishes the relationship, so to speak. And on that level, that is not impacted by what we do because the energy itself is infinite and it cannot be impacted. But on the receptacle level, on the end user level, our avodah does certainly impact. And then we said, actually, when you go deeper, the fact is that the orot are not impacted as they are in terms of their energy, but in terms of their deeper essence, the purpose of light, the purpose of the energy is to end up in some kind of receptacle. So the fact that we're not allowing the receptacle to hold that energy, to establish that religion and that relationship is in fact something that we do impact. And then we said on a higher level, this goes to in regards to the source of that energy. And that's where we're up to over here. Quote the last paragraph of chapter 3. And just to give a little bit of a context as to what we're talking about here. So we said that there are, of course, 10 sfirot. The 10 sfirot begin with Chachma and go down. Chachma, Bina, Dat are the three intellectual systems. And then you have the 7 sfirot, which are the emotional systems. Beyond those 10 is an 11th level, which is called Keter. Keter, we said, is split into 2, Atik and Arich, the inner level of Keter and the external level of Keter. And I just want to explain that for a moment. The word Keter means a crown. And now a crown has 2 aspects. On one hand, it's something that sits upon somebody's head. It's a hat. So because of the fact that it sits upon somebody's head, you realize that it has something about itself that is above the head, so to speak. So that's the external level of what the crown is. But of course, the crown represents so much. It is a representation of royalty. It is a representation of the country, of the national pride and all that kind of thing. So it's much more than just a hat, and certainly more than just the value of the materials that are there. You can have a hat that's more beautiful or more valuable in terms of gold, silver, diamonds, or what have you. But the value of this hat is so much deeper. And so the same thing with regards to what we refer to as Keter in the Sfirot system. It has an external level, which is the source of Ishtalshalut. It is the source because it is the immediate connection, the first connection between the infinite and a finite space. But as an internal aspect, which is completely beyond the elements of creating a finite space and whatnot. So that's with regards to what we're talking about over here in the last paragraph of chapter 3. However, on the level of Atik, we said that it does not matter to God. And this is because Atik is the singular master source of all sources mentioned earlier. So when the Avodat HaKodesh quoted and said basically on a certain level, it does matter, but on the level, the singular master source of all sources, it does not matter. So that's on the level of Atik, the internal level of Keter. Pay close attention to the term, continuing the text, source of all sources, rather than the source of emanations. And this is because this level is well beyond being a source of emanations. In truth, it is even separate from being considered a source, as the word atik is related to the word vayatek, meaning, and he separated himself. This means that atik is even separate from and beyond arich. This term source of all sources is then not a literal term, it's only a figurative term because it's so beyond arich, it cannot be truly described as a source. So it is on this level that the verse states, if you sin, how have you affected him? And with all of your iniquities, what have you done to him? If you're righteous, what did you give to him? So basically what we're saying again, to be able to summarize where we are over here, we're saying that, hang on a second. We are saying that on this level of divinity, which is so truly beyond the finite aspects of the world, it can't even be described as a source of the finite aspects because of the fact that it is truly, truly separate. And because of that distance, not just physical or figurative or even spiritual distance, it's so distant it cannot be even described to be within proximity in any way whatsoever, and it cannot even be described as an extension or even as a source. And so therefore on that level, the verse states clearly that that there's no impact, so to speak. There's a question here, and there's also
Are you talking about the chain of creation? Is that what you're speaking about?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Absolutely. So the publication book that we're referring to is a document that Rabbi Smith sent out already, and that is a PDF. It begins with the words in the Torah, Lo tieh meshakela v'akara b'artzecha. So you should have received it in your email. I'll ask Rabbi Smith to email it to you. Okay, and now we're up to chapter 3. Excuse me, chapter 4. Now, the Rebbe doesn't ever stop where it seems like you need to stop. The Rebbe always wants to go deeper. He always wants to go higher. And so that's exactly what we're going to do here. We want to see, does God truly, truly, truly care? Yes, there's an aspect of divinity that we explained quite clearly here that is beyond our frame of reference at all, and beyond the relationship with us in a relative manner. And of course, that makes sense. But the Rebbe wants to point out that actually this whole conversation goes deeply into the essence of God. And for that, again, we need to understand that. And just to remind everybody that this is all the intellectual / academic / theological element of this essay. We will bring these ideas very soon into certain practical relevances with regards to some really powerful ideas, reflecting on how do we keep ourselves inspired and moving forward. And that's really the theme over here. But in order to be able to understand that, first we want to understand the intellectual underpinnings of this entire conversation, and that gives us the energy to be able to tie into these ideas that we're going to discuss. So chapter 4, in fact, God truly cares.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Again, which Rebbe was this?
This is our Rebbe, the Lubavitch Rebbe.
Okay.
Still, when we look at the text more closely, it would seem that in fact the words "and you shall serve God your God" apply not only to the levels within the system of Hishalshlus, but even beyond it. And in order to see how that works, we need to preface the matter with another discussion: the recognition of an apparent contradiction within a single verse. And a grammar leveler is going to love this. The verse begins by using the third person terminology, "and you shall serve God your God," and then concludes in the very same sentence in first person, and I will remove sickness. I love these conversations because the fact of the matter is that, the academics, I used to be director of Chabad University of Washington, and students used to talk about, Bible criticism and all that kind of thing. And my point to them all, when they try to say that, that the Torah or the Bible, whatever they want to call it, has several editors, and specifically referring to Chumash, because, in Jewish tradition, we certainly agree that the rest of Tanakh have several authors. But in terms of the Chumash, the first 5 books themselves, they talk about how there are several editors. And my response to that is, well, if there were several editors, at least somebody would have done a better job. Because the Torah is so cryptic, it's so strange the way everything's set up. Every single verse has just very, very, nuances that are, or questions that come up. If you're trying to write a story, this is not the way to write a story. If you're trying to write a history, this is not the way to write a history. If you're trying to write a law book, this is not the way to write a law book. Everything about it, it's not sensible in terms of the entire system. And that leads us into the questions of why, and into these deeper discussions. And that's how we approach the divine, because we recognize the divine is not surface deep. It's infinite. And here's a perfect example, because in the same verse, the Torah changes from third person conversation, suddenly just changes without a question whatsoever, immediately changes into first person. And the question is why? So back to the text. In general, the Torah is written in third person rather than from Moshe's viewpoint, using phraseology such as, and God spoke to me, or even from God's viewpoint, using phraseology such as, and I spoke to Moshe. Rather, it is the third person narration that tells the story, and God spoke to Moshe. The Ramban, and this is Nachmanides, circa the 1100s, explains that this third person narration is beyond Moshe and God's name Havaya. Havaya is Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, the tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of God, which in general is that which we understand enlivens the world. So the reason for this is that even though the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, or as we refer to it in Chabad Chassidic theology, is typically referred to as Havaya, that even though the name Havaya is above creation, as evidenced by the fact that the meaning of the name is was, is, and will be in one unit, which is an impossibility within our frame of reference. However, considering the fact that it denotes an element of time, it is still relevant to creation. So you see this sort of push me, pull you, so to speak, with regards to this name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. On the one hand, it wraps all of time into one single unit, because the word itself means was, is, and will be. But at the same time, the fact that it has a reference point to which we can relate means that it's above, but relative. The third person narration, on the other hand, is the essence of God, which is that which speaks about and narrates that which occurred within Ishtalshalos, i.e. the conversation between Havaya and Moshe. So the system is written in such a way that in general, it's, so to speak, talking from the essence of God, who's describing what happens within this world, within the confines of physicality, and that's where physicality and spirituality meet. Question.
You're making me think that the Torah intentionally does these switches so that all the high level rabbis that follow will add to it. It's an intentional thing. God intentionally made it very confusing because he wanted the higher rabbis to do the clarification. I mean, to me, that's pretty obvious. That
the one thing I would disagree with is it's not for rabbis, it's for all of us to be able to absorb the information. Now, the rabbis will point things out that we wouldn't have noticed otherwise.
Yeah.
But the important thing is to be able to essence, to be able to understand divinity, and to be able to absorb these ideas. And that's exactly why these concepts are written in this kind of way. And that's what we're going to do over here.
Right.
That this change of tense,
the tense,
is going to allude very, very, very deep.
Wow.
Okay. So the third is referred to, back to the text. The third level of the third person is referred to as the third, as in the verse, he will give us life for 2 days and on the third day. And the context of that verse is not critical to here. It's just to point out that there are these ideas. And Kabbalistically, this verse is explained as follows. The 2 days spoken of refers to Ishtalshelus. Ishtalshelus, like we said, is the chain of reaction which creates the world, in which everything can be split into two. Mimale Kolamin and Soviv Kolamin. To explain what these two ideas are, there's the energy of God that is within the world in such a way that is relevant and relative to every single element of creation. So an atom is given life and given energy and given its particular energy in order to be able to do what it needs to do. On a human level, of course, the human being is given life and energy in that is relative to that particular person. On the other hand, if a tree outside or a bird or even a speck of dust, each one of these things needs to be created at each moment. If they're not created at each moment with their characteristics and everything that make up that individual element of life or existence, they cannot exist, because everything is dependent upon God giving that element of creation its capability to be able to exist. So that's the energy on that level in which God is invested personally, so to speak, on every detail of the world, that's referred to as Memale. Because Memale Kalman means he fills the world. On the other hand, God is not just about creation. God is also, of course, God as he is himself is beyond creation completely. He's not dependent on creation whatsoever. God is not, to use a crass example, Tinkerbell, so to speak, clap for me and I'll exist. God's existence is completely and absolutely separate and totally beyond the world. He does not depend on the world. The world depends on him. And on that level, there's an element of creation called Sovev. And Sovev is as God creates in an automatic way by virtue of his being. And on that level, there's no difference between one level of another level. If you're talking about spiritual levels, there's no difference between Atzilut and this physical world. It's all, God is so far beyond all of those things. It's all. And so just for an example, let's just mute. Just as an example, we don't go about our lives worrying about, oops, I didn't mean that. Sorry about that. We don't go about our lives worrying about atoms that we interfere with. Our living is on a completely different level, and so it doesn't concern us whether we interact with atoms on any particular way. Quarks, neutrons, all those kinds of things, we know that they exist, but our living is beyond those elements of creation, and so therefore they don't concern us whatsoever. And so likewise, on the level of Sovev, Sovev means encompassing. That is God, as God is beyond and creates in this encompassing, general, all transcendent level. So those are two different ways that God creates through these two elements of a relationship, so to speak. And they both need to be there, because on the one hand, if God only created through Memale, then the world would be so crass, we would not be capable of touching and absorbing godliness. On the other hand, if God only created through Sovev, we would not be able to feel our own existence. We would just be in constant awe and shock of God's transcendence. And so therefore God needs to create with both of them. So that's one of this, the elements of these dual roles at the same time. We also spoke about orot and kelim, and that we already spoke about before, so I don't want to get into that whole thing, but the energies or the lights and the receptacles through which they are translated into our physical world, to be able to create our physical world, to be able to create the relationship, and everything includes these two elements. There's also the light as it is to itself versus as it expresses itself in a revealed state to something beside itself. And that's a very powerful concept. When you think about the sun creates light, and that light really is infinite and totally, in fact, invisible until it reflects off of something. In space, you don't see the light because the light is just traveling and is not bouncing off of anything. It's only once it actually comes into contact with something that you see the light. And the same thing with regards to spiritually, that entire concept exists within creation as well. The light is to and of itself, but it also is, as it is, relates to something else. So you keep seeing this concept of duality. In contrast, the Rebbe continues, the third day refers to the essence of God. So now the Rebbe answers the question to get back into this whole thing, to be able to reopen the question of, does God truly care? Getting back to our conundrum, following the text, regarding the phraseology in our text, in our verse. At first, the narrator states that by stating Havaya, the level of Havaya will bless your water and your food. Afterwards, the verse adds that after doing so, I, the narrator himself, will remove sickness from your midst. So if the essence of God is getting involved, so to speak, it is self-understood that the avodah indeed impacts not only the level of Havaya, but the very essence of God. But that seems to completely undermine what we just explained. From a perspective beyond Ishtalshalut, the verse states, if you are righteous, what did you give him? So the question is reopened. How could we possibly contradict this verse that says that we can't possibly impact God with our avodah? And so the Rebbe explains in the next chapter a very, very powerful idea. And this is going to be really an answer to a question that was asked last week. That are we talking about, people who are doing everything, so to speak, in Judaism or not? And I said, actually, this idea discussed in this mimer, while it is very, very, very intense, and you'll see the Rebbe is going to ratchet up several levels, but this is absolutely applicable to everybody on every single level. And on the basic level, we're going to talk about it here, and then afterwards we're going to break it down. Next week we're going to go down into the particulars. But right now we're going to answer the question with pointing out that there's a difference between the avodah itself, the details of the avodah, and what you're accomplishing. And that's where we're going right here. Chapter 5. To answer this, we must point out that there's a difference between the avodah itself with all its details versus the result of the avodah. God, as he is above Ishtalshalut, is indeed not concerned about the details of the avodah. Which particular avodah, in what circumstances, how it is performed, or what have you. But the results in which even lowly creatures who are referred to by the term creature, briot, to signify that their only quality is the fact that God himself created them, are refined and elevated, through which they are transformed into godliness. This is something that truly concerns the essence of God. And it is this which is being referred to in the verse, and you shall serve God your God, and I will remove sickness. So let's take something that I think all of us are probably under, an avodah that all of us are familiar with. The avodah of charity, tzedakah, Okay, first of all, the term charity is, of course, a terrible term. The word tzedakah means righteousness. But because we speak English, we're stuck to the term charity or the Hebrew word tzedakah. So all of us give, but all of us give on different levels. There might be some people over here who are multimillionaires and have no problem whatsoever writing checks for $100,000 and that's it, no sweat off their back. And in fact, they enjoy doing it. You have other people who simply, are trying to pay their rent and on a regular day. So we give 5 cents to tzedakah every single day. And that's what we do. The value of one in comparison to the other really has nothing to do with the amount given. It has to do with the person and the situation in which the person is giving it. And that's what we're talking about over here. The details are not nearly as important as the fact that is the person refining themselves through it. That by a person giving from their own hard-earned work and their hard-earned cash to something that is beyond themselves, they are connecting themselves to godliness. They are recognizing that the world is not just about themselves. They are doing something beyond themselves, and that creates a refinement of self. And that can happen equally if the donation is 5 cents or $500,000 or $5 million. And you could have somebody who gives $5 million, but does it in such a way that is so self-absorbed and so self-wrapped up, actually, that the mitzvah is done, but the accomplishments within oneself is completely undermined because of the fact that the person is not refining themselves through that process. That doesn't mean to say that a person shouldn't do the mitzvah. A person should absolutely do the mitzvah, and we're going to talk about that soon. In other words, even if a person is not done, refining themselves, or even if a person is self-absorbed or anything like that, we'll talk about that. It's most important to accomplish. But in terms of touching the essence of God, that is the fact that the person is doing avodah, they're serving God in some kind of way. And we're going to discuss what service is. In other words, what does it mean when we use that term as the essay continues? But now, the Rebbe points out that we can now understand why the Torah changes the term of the blessing. Previously, the Torah had stated, any sickness which I placed upon Egypt, I will not place upon you. In that case, the Torah was talking about the possibility of sickness, and the blessing is such that the malady will not actualize. In our verse, there's a greater novelty. Even in the case where there is an actual sickness, it will be removed. And we're going to talk about a sickness that every single human being is afflicted with. And that's the level of sickness that we're talking about here. It is obvious that a greater capability is needed to remove a sickness as opposed to keeping someone healthy. Your standard general practitioner is capable of giving you, a regimen of exercise, eat certain types of foods and that kind of thing, just to be able to keep you healthy. But once a person becomes sick, at that point, you need a greater doctor, somebody who's a greater specialist in order to be able to get involved and remove the sickness. And it is for this reason that the essence of God states, I will remove sickness from amongst you. There's a sickness that's within every single one of us, and that sickness can only be removed by the essence of God. And that is something that is not natural, so to speak, because the sickness, the disease that we're referring to is something that is absolutely natural. We're going to talk about it later, and that is true altruism. True altruism is, in other words, the idea of I will remove sickness from amongst you. The result of that is absolute true altruism, as opposed to ego, self-benefit, and those kinds of things, which are sicknesses that are within ourselves. And we're trying to truly serve God as he is and not allow ourselves to be involved. So this is something that is truly beyond. And the only way to be able to attach ourselves to that is by God himself giving us this blessing. So from here, we're going to go into each stage of service. what does it mean? We asked the question before, what are we talking about when we're talking about serving God? Does God impact, what is the term serve? When we explained that actually it does impact God. God wants us to serve him. And that's really the whole conversation here. God wants us to serve him on the deepest of levels even, but the idea of service is number one. The most important thing is transformation of self. At the same time, there are several levels of this. And that's what we're going to discuss next. And this is going to be actually the relevance to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, because this is very much the conversation that we should be having within ourselves around this time of year. So that's where we're up to right now. If there are any questions, I can quickly answer them. And if not, we'll see you on Friday. Any questions? Okay, practical elements coming up, God willing, and we'll see you Friday and we'll crack into this essay more. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.